Hello, welcome back to Ling 201, Introduction to Linguistics. I'm your professor, Brett C. Nelson. Today is our first lecture on phonology, and so this is the start of week 4. Weeks 4 through 6 will be on phonology. Today, however, we'll learn about a concept called phonemes, and we will start to solve phonological problems. So the readings for today were from chapter 3, section 0 and 1, as well as the appendix. The appendix talks about how we look at phonological problems and how we solve them. So yeah. Happening this week, nothing. We just have today's lecture, and we will not have a discussion meeting on Thursday. Instead, we'll be recognizing the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Normally, the first week of a chapter we'll have discussion questions due. That's not going to be the case this week because we have no class on Thursday. Instead, discussion questions are due the following Thursday, and then the quiz would be the week after that, the week and the day after that. But we'll start today with another land acknowledgement. So I'm speaking to you today from the area where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis. And this name is now used to refer to the entire city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which is signed by this land's stewards, representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Cree and Ktunaxa, as well as members of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I am a newcomer to this land. I come from Boulanger 5 years ago now. Boulanger, also known as Louisiana, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi River, a word for the Great River of North America. I strive to learn more about the land, its peoples, their languages, and their histories every day. And at the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with a spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So today, I'll be introducing the key topics within phonology, which is the study of sound systems. And we'll discuss how the phones from the phonetics can be distributed within a language's phonological system. Then we'll begin to distinguish between phonetic, with those phones, and phonemic, with phonemes, and the representations, both the concepts that cause us to need to distinguish them, and how we will represent that distinction in writing and transcription. After that, we will start to work through some basic phonology problems. That's will be kind of the theme of the next 3 weeks is learning things about how phonology can interact and how we represent that, and then looking at some data sets to use those concepts and tools to solve some basic phonology problems. And they'll get more complicated as we go on through the 3 weeks, of course. So phonology is the study of how sounds go together. So we can ask how they combine when they are near each other. And so if we compare the P in prime and the P in speech, we see that the P sound in prime is aspirated at the beginning of a word, and more so that it kind of devoices or aspirates the following R, so there's no vibration until you hit the vowel prime. Whereas in speech, the P is following an S sound, so it becomes unaspirated. So this kind of distribution is part of the phonology of English, and just where we get aspirated and unaspirated voiceless stops. Another question we can ask in phonology is how sounds contrast with other sounds. So we compare s and z and loose versus lose. We see that there is a distinction when we change that s in the voiceless alveolar fricative into a voiced alveolar fricative. We get a change in meaning when we actually put them in words. So loose means something a bit different than the verb lose. And so we know that S and Z are contrastive sounds in English. And phonology also tells us how they form that coherent system, which we call a phonology, in the language. So yeah, the system of how those sounds kind of cohere together and contrast with each other is that language's phonology. There are 3 levels of analysis we'll talk about in this course, and really in general. First of these is prosodic, which is the organization of the speech stream into syllables and larger kind of groups, phrases, utterances, bigger and bigger prosodic groups is what they call them. Then there's the segmental level of analysis, in which we've kind of talked about that previously with the phones, but it's the individual speech sounds from those phonetics, those phones. And then there's the featural level of analysis, and these are below the segmental level, and the actual building blocks of our building blocks. So they're what the things that actually contrast within the language's phonological system. So we'll start by dividing what we've talked about previously with phones into phonemes and allophones. So as you might have noticed, or you may not have, but speakers do produce many more phonetic distinctions than they can actually perceive, or that they readily perceive. If they actually think about it, and really listen, they might be able to get at those precise phonetic distinctions. But in reality, they have much broader levels of distinctions. So if you compare the word rat versus ratty, you might perceive the final sound in rat and the second to last sound, the final consonant in ratty, as the same sound, but in reality they're quite different sounds phonetically. So you have a stop in case of rat, and you have a flap in the case, or a tap in the case of ratty. So a more rhotic R-like sound in ratty. And in most languages that would be their R sound, but in English it's associated with the T phoneme, or the T sound, because the T is the phoneme. So the T is the phoneme, and we have different levels, different types of T allophones underneath that, and at the allophonic level. And one of those allophones is the flap. But if we were to change that comparison into the comparison between rat and rad, we would perceive very easily a difference between that final sound in rat and the final sound in rad. Even though they're both stops, one's voiceless and one's voiced, so we have a distinction that is readily available to perceive in the phonology. So as I was saying, and we have 2 different phonemes for that, but with rat and ratty, the T sounds and that sound are actually allophones of the same phoneme, being T. So allophones are those different phones that each refer to the same phoneme, these are the actual pronounced and physical phone, the physical disruption of the airstream, and they're the variants of the same phoneme. So if we were to draw out an allophone diagram for just these 3 sounds, we'd see that the T phoneme divides into 2 allophones just for these 3 examples. We have a T allophone and the flap allophone, whereas that D phoneme just goes down into a D allophone, a voiced D allophone. And when we talk about contrasts in phonology, what we're actually talking about is the contrast between phonemes. And you'll see that sometimes phonemes can share allophones, but we still perceive them differently because they're different phonemes at the phonemic level. And so these phonemes are those contrastive units of sound that are more abstract within the brain, within the mind, and within the phonological system. So these are the abstract categories that actually affect meaning because they are more abstract and closer to kind of mental representations. They're a bit closer to the meaning we put behind these sounds and words. So if you're familiar with kind of genetics or biology, you can draw the analogy between allophones are to phonemes as alleles are to genes. So the allophones are the particular instantiation of the meaningful phonemes. So one of the first steps in phonology is to determine phonemes within a phonological system. In other words, we have to determine which sounds make a contrastive meaning when placed within certain contexts. And so to do that, we have to find their contrastive distributions. So this will be to find which sounds contrast with what, and this is a fundamental part of the phonological analysis that we'll be talking about in this course. To do this, we have to find minimal pairs, and minimal pairs are words that differ by a single segment in the same position. So we saw that with the last slide with rat and rad, but you could also do it with any number of really any pair of phonemes in any language. So we'll look to leaf and beef. So L and leaf and beef mean different things. So we could probably say that L and B are different, belong to different phonemes. We could also say that about alive and arrive. Changing that L to an R changed the meaning in the word. You had that adjective alive and that verb arrive just when you change that single sound. So we know that L and R belong to different phonemes in English, or in whichever variety of English we're talking about. And we test that in. And so these are called minimal pairs. Minimal pairs demonstrate a contrastive distribution. This means that the phones can appear in the same environments as each other, and when they do, they lead to a difference in the meaning between those words in which they appear. So we saw that with the T and the D appear after ra, and depending on your choice, you get a different word, depending on your choice of those phones. Same thing with the l and b and leaf and beef, and the l and r and alive and arrive. These are all minimal pairs demonstrating a contrastive distribution of those bolded phones. And so contrastive distribution is the primary way we can tell what allophones belong to different phonemes. This contrasts with a complementary distribution. So a complementary distribution is the opposite of this contrastive distribution. And this is what occurs when a phone appears in a non-overlapping but mutually exclusive environments as another phone. So for example, we have root and rude. You might notice that in the second example, the vowel sound oo is a bit longer than the vowel sound in root. However, they are in complementary distributions because the short oo sound only appears before voiceless sounds, whereas the long oo appears before voiced sound. And of course, T being voiceless and D being voiced, we find that this distribution is occurring with these words. But what's key is that the long oo never appears before voiceless sounds, whereas the short oo never appears before voiced sounds. So this mutually exclusive environments, non-overlapping, gives us the complementary distribution between the short oo and the long oo, and that tells us that these are actually allophones of the same phoneme, and we'll just call, for simplicity's sake, call that phoneme oo. And you could draw that complementary distribution using that branching tree. So we have the oo in slanted brackets as the phoneme level, and then in square brackets for the allophones, we have the the short oo on one side and the long oo on the other. For another example, we'll go back to consonants and something I mentioned at the beginning with the different types of P sounds in English. So in spear and peer, we have an unaspirated P in spear, and that's appearing between S and I, the E sound. And then in peer, we have a aspirated P appearing between the beginning of the word, in other words, the word boundary, and that same vowel E. So removing that S changed how we pronounce that P, but it also gives us a complementary distribution. So if we were to try to if you try to aspirate that P, you could, but really it sounds a bit odd. And so aspirated P never readily appears between S and E, whereas the unaspirated P, never appears between the word boundary and E, or in these monosyllables, at least. So and P are in complementary distribution, and they're allophones of the same phoneme P. And usually we just go with the simplest form as the phoneme category. So we put that phoneme category in angled brackets, slanted brackets. Yeah, slanted brackets, I'll call them. And we have that phoneme P, and we have the two allophones P and P as the allophones in complementary distribution for that phoneme tree. So another type of distribution, it's not technically a distribution, that's why we call it variation, and that's the free variation. So this is where two phones that appear in the same exact environment but don't cause a change in meaning. So it's basically your contrastive distribution when the contrast doesn't actually produce a change in the actual meaning of the word. So if we were to compare pronunciation of the word back and back, so back and back, we would perceive that as the same word, even though the pronunciation of that final sound, and the k sound and the k sound, are quite different. I mean, they're both velar, but one is a lot louder, and it's in fact an ejective, which is a different type of phones we didn't really talk about, but it is one type of phone that English speakers can produce, and sometimes in this very type of environment. However, the fact that they produce it doesn't add to the phoneme inventory of English. It just makes another allophone of that K sound. So we have K and K as allophones in free variation of the same phoneme K. Because if you change between them, you end up with the same word meaning, like the back of your body. So free variation more often applies to descriptions of whole words rather than individual sounds. But it can still apply to individual sounds if you think about it in that way. So you have the difference in pronunciation of either and either. Normally those would be different phonemes. You have a diphthong on one end and a long E on the other. However, for this particular word, those vowels are in free variation. The pronunciations are in free variation. You could say either or either, and it would mean the same thing to you and to whoever's listening to you. So they're free variants of the word either, which we write that way, but we have multiple pronunciations for it. There are plenty of examples of these in English. And so as I was saying, this is basically a minimal pair, which was used in contrastive distribution. However, instead of there being a difference in meaning, there is no difference in meaning, and when that occurs, you have free variance and free variation. So we've talked about minimal pairs, we've talked about free variants. Now we'll talk about near minimal pairs, and if you could kind of guess what that means, it means that they are almost minimal pairs but not quite. If you're looking throughout a language's data and the words it has, you might not be able to find exact minimal pairs. However, you find these things that are called near minimal pairs that are that can tell us just almost as much as a minimal pair can. And so within these near minimal pairs, these are going to be pairs that differ by the phones we're examining in order to determine their distribution, plus some distant segment that doesn't seem to be affecting the actual pronunciation. So, for example, I think we have one. What matters for these near minimal pairs is that we have identical segments that are directly adjacent to the target phones that we're examining. So, if we're looking at vision and mission, and we're targeting that middle sound in j and sh. However, we notice that the initial sound v and m are also different. We don't have what that means is we don't have an actual minimal pair here, but we have a near minimal pair in that the vowel sounds that surround the sh, the j, and the sh, namely this lax I and the schwa sound after it, are adjacent to it, are identical. So what we have here is a near minimal pair with j and sh, where both sounds are occurring between that I and that And so this gives us solid evidence that we have separate phonemes for j and sh because they're appearing in identical contexts in a small sense, but what we're actually looking at is this near minimal pair. But it's still useful, as I said, this is still useful because of that the directly adjacent vowels that are probably most important to how we actually pronounce the consonants between them. They're the same, but the consonant in between them is different, so we have that contrast between those two consonants, j and sh. They're parts of separate phonemes that are j and sh. You could also create a near minimal pair by adding a phone. And so we have, for example, the difference between sting and string. In the first example, we don't have that R after the T and before the E. But in the second example, we do have that R. So what we have here is a near minimal pair, and what's differing is that addition, and so that R has changed the meaning of sting into string. Then what we can propose is that R is a phoneme on its own, or the allophone of the r is a different phoneme. So adding that R actually changes the meaning. So at minimum we're adding a phoneme, and it's probably that R. So moving on, there are other ways we can examine these distributions that might lead us to propose that there are phonemes in this language. So sometimes sounds are restricted in kind of opposite ways, however, and they don't give us those minimal pairs. So, for example, we have in English a case where H, the h sound, the glottal fricative, never appears at the ends of words, and ng never appears at the beginning of the words. So we don't have any minimal pairs. So you might be inclined to think that h and ng are allophones of the same phoneme because they never give us any minimal pairs. But if you think about it, a velar nasal stop sound, ng, and a glottal fricative h sound aren't very similar to each other. So there's not really that relation. There's not really an inclination to propose a relationship between those two sounds that would cause one sound to turn into the other, or cause some sound to turn into an H at the beginnings of words and an at the end of words. So these sounds are actually distinct enough that it is extremely unlikely that these are allophones of the same phoneme. It's just a coincidence that their distributions don't overlap. And so this gives us another rule of phonemes, is that allophones of a single phoneme should be phonetically similar in some way, whether it's with a place of articulation, a manner of articulation, or even sub-features within that. So like we saw with the stops and the unaspirated voice stops and the aspirated voice stops. They're both types of P, one just happened to have a puff of air after it. And so that we're more inclined to believe is an allophone of a single phoneme P, because of their phonetic similarity, with both being bilabial stops. So next, we'll talk about how languages can neutralize a contrast. So neutralization of contrast refers to what happens when separate phonemes share a phone as one of their allophones. So this is somewhat rare in English, but it does occur. And for example, we have the voiceless aspirated stop in t, a tab, and the voice stop in dab, the alveolar stop. We also have the unaspirated or unreleased stop in bat, and the voice stop in bad at the end of bad. But if we were to get similar words to what we had earlier with ratty, we have batty from bat and batty from bad. We see that these T and D phonemes, which we established with these two sets of minimal pairs earlier, right here with tab and dab and bat and bad, they're not a minimal pair when you have them in this configuration. So what you have here is an example where we had the contrastive distribution of tab and dab and bat and bad with those minimal pairs being kind of neutralized in that they're both, in this example we have both of these phonemes becoming the flap sound in this context before an E after the stressed vowel a. So the baddie is like you talk about someone who's bad being a baddie, and someone who's like a bat being batty. We have that same tap sound. So this is what I'm talking about when we talk about contrast neutralization, is this particular environment, the contrast between those two otherwise contrastive phonemes being no longer a contrast because they produce the same allophone. So this can occur at wider levels, but this is probably as the most frequent case that it occurs in English, is with these two t and d sounds. So t and d are separate phonemes. However, their allophones are in contrastive distributions at the beginnings and ends of words, such as in tab and dab and bat and bad. However, between a stressed vowel and an unstressed vowel, they both surface as that flap the. And so this contrast between them is neutralized in that environment. So that was a case where the difference between phonemes isn't as simple as just looking at a single pair. You have to look at multiple pairs to really establish the actual distribution of phonemes within a language. Now we could start to compare phoneme differences across languages. So languages that we know aren't really mutually intelligible, speakers can't really understand each other speaking across them, we still like to compare the actual difference in their and the distribution of their phones. So, for example, we have the bilabial stop, the voiceless bilabial stop in Hindustani, which is a name for the Hindi and Urdu languages. We have pal, which means to take care of. However, this contrasts with the word pal, which is a knife blade. So we have what in English would be that pa and pa, the difference between a voiceless unaspirated stop and a voiceless aspirated stop, being allophonic in English, not creating a meaning difference. In Hindustani, they do create a meaning difference. And so between that word boundary and it's a minimal pair. They produce that difference in meaning for the word pal and pal. And so pa and pa and pa are separate phonemes in Hindustani, where in English, in that environment, they would be, or just in English, pa and pa would be allophones. So we have the aspirated stop in pal in English, and the unaspirated or unreleased stop in lap at the end of the stop. So that is a different distribution, which is the complementary distribution, whereas in Hindustani they were in contrastive distribution. So in English, these are allophones of the same phoneme, whereas in Hindustani, they were allophones of separate phonemes. And so just because English has this relationship between them, these two different allophones, and how where it places each of them, Hindustani might have a different relationship between them, and indeed it is an entire contrast between them. So they are different categorical phonemes in Hindustani. So languages can also differ in how they distribute their allophones, kind of being in an opposite manner. So we have an English word like pop, this crab pop, cherry crab, I'm not getting the joke, I don't know why I put it there. But it is a can of pop or a can of soda, but we'll call it pop because we're here in Canada, we'll call it pop. And it makes sense for the contrast that I'm trying to draw. So we have the aspirated stop at the beginning and the unaspirated stop at the end. So we have voiceless stops being aspirated at the beginnings of words and unaspirated at the ends of words. Whereas in Kakchikel, a Mayan language, we have a word like pop. We have an unaspirated stop at the beginning of the word and an aspirated stop at the end of the word. And so that applies to all of their stops as well. Voiceless stops are unaspirated at the beginnings of words, but aspirated at the ends. So what we have here is a case of two allophones of the same phoneme in both of these languages. Both of these, we have a single p phoneme branching into two different allophones with the aspirated and unaspirated version of p. However, in Kakchikel, that distribution is unaspirated at the beginning and aspirated at the end. And in English, it's aspirated at the beginning and unaspirated at the end. And so languages don't have to follow the exact rules of English. They can flip them. They can have them flip. It's not like they're derived from English. It doesn't mean the same thing in English, but the example is to show that the distribution of the allophones isn't always the same when you go from language to language to language. And this can be a potential challenge when you're trying to learn English as a speaker of Kakchikel or learn Kakchikel as a speaker of English, and you have to kind of redraw your allophonic relationships and your distributional relationships among those allophones of the same phoneme. So just a very interesting thing that I actually study quite often. So next we'll talk about the levels of representation. So I kind of hinted at this in the previous slides, but what we are talking about at the segmental level is that these are segments. And so segments were written with a single character in IPA for the most part. But how do we actually differentiate between when we're talking about them as phonemes and we're talking about them as allophones? Well, we could ask, what are the words made up of? Well, they're made up of both, and you'll have two levels of representation in order to represent them. At the more meaningful level, you have words made up of phonemes, but when you're actually producing them in the air disruptions, they're made up of those physical disruptions in the air, which are the allophones. And so the phonetic level of representation are those pronounced allophones, and we're going to write these in this class and in general in IPA with the phonetic brackets, which are also called square brackets, and those are these brackets here, which kind of square off the transcription. Is the underlying phonemes that these allophones belong to. So these are the actual categories that the allophones are members of that are representing the things that actually change the meaning if you were to change them. So when you have those contrasted distributions, it's the phonemes that's changing, and so these that you have to represent that at a level either kind of underlying that surface form of the allophones. And to represent this phonemic level, you use phonemic brackets, which are also called angled brackets or slashes, forward slashes in this case. So those are, whenever you use those, you're actually talking about the actual meaning changing categorical phoneme as the segments within those brackets, rather than the actual pronounced allophones that are in the square phonetic brackets. So if we were to transcribe a word like prong, you can transcribe it phonetically by noting the aspiration and the length of those vowels, of the vowel, and you'd have that velar nasal at the end. So you have the aspirated p, r, a, ng as your phonetic transcription, and of course, depending on your variety of English, you could have either of those vowels. So you'd represent that at this level, but at the phonemic level, there's only really one way to write it, and that's to represent the actual phonemes. So you have the p, the r, the a, and the ng in phonemic brackets, those angled brackets there at the end, or at the bottom of the slide there. Another example, we have phonetic representation of writing. So you'd have that the I diphthong, ting, unstressed, so it's not aspirated. But it might also be that flap, right? So writing, yeah, you have stressed vowel, unstressed. That's the environment that you'd expect the flap to be. So you could transcribe that as the flap. And then you have ing. So that, yeah, writing. It looks a bit different than how we actually write it in orthography, but that would be an acceptable phonetic transcription of the word writing. However, you could make that a lax vowel in writing to writing. Really, that level of distinction in that environment is probably not one of a meaningful difference. Certainly isn't. And whether you pronounce it with that tense ing or that lax ing doesn't change the meaning. So that would be an acceptable variation to represent in the phonetic level of representation. Another way you could pronounce that is to actually pronounce that T, as there's some environments that don't flap their T's in that environment. There's, some varieties that don't flap the T there. Like in Britain, they would say writing, writing. And so you could transcribe it with that allophone there, and all of those would be acceptable phonetic transcriptions of writing depending on what you're actually hearing and what's actually being produced. However, they all go back to the same phonemic representation underlyingly, which we could write like this, that only writes the phonemes that make up the word. So we have that r, that diphthong I, the t sound, the e, the front high front vowel, and then that velar nasal consonant at the end. So what we have here are three different level phonetic representations of the singular phonemic representation of writing or writing or writing. So that is a run through of kind of the basic concepts in phonology. We'll expand on those and develop our toolkit in the coming weeks for solving phonological problems, but we do have enough to look at a data set and answer some questions about what's going on in the phonology represented by that data set. So here we have a basic list of things to do when solving a problem in phonology. The first step is to find minimal pairs, and if there are minimal pairs, use them to show the contrasted distribution in the target phones that we're looking at. And if there isn't any minimal pair, if there aren't any minimal pairs, then look for near minimal pairs and do the same. Use those near minimal pairs to show a somewhat contrasted distribution. And those will give you your phoneme categories, your different allophones that belong to different phonemes. And if there are no near minimal pairs, then you can look for complementary distribution of the phones we're looking at. And that'll give you allophones of the same phoneme. And so always state which environments each phone appears in. This will help you kind of find those near minimal pairs and those complementary distributions. And then you'll be very close to proposing a solution to the problem and the questions being asked of the data set. So for an example problem set, we have these data from Tagalog. Tagalog is a Filipino language from the Philippines, spoken by many, many people, even here in Canada. I'm sure some of you in this class do speak Tagalog or are aware of people who speak Tagalog. But we'll just look at these 6 words in Tagalog and consider the sounds h and the h and the glottal stop. So the glottal fricative and the glottal stop, they're at the same place of articulation, so we might, that's similar enough that they could be in an allophonic relationship, but they are different phones, so they could be contrastive as well. So we have to determine whether they are indeed contrastive or if there are allophones of a single phoneme. So we have the word cajon for box. B, we have hari for king. Then we have umagos to flow. Then ari, property. Then caon to fetch. Then humangos to pant. So take a few minutes to look at those, and then I'll help you out in a couple of seconds. Okay, so if we were to use that that checklist of how to work through our problem set, first we would have try to find any minimal pairs, and if we look through, we note that we do have minimal pairs. So we have cajon and caon. We also have hari and ari. And then we also have umagos and humangos. It's a near minimal pair for this one. There's an N in that case, and there's no N here. But what's critical for this one is that at the beginning of a word before oo, either of these two glottal sounds can appear. So what that tells me is that in Tagalog, we do have these minimal pairs between h and glottal stop, so we have contrastive distribution. And that tells me that H and glottal stop are allophones of different phonemes. So to write that out, we would say that in Tagalog, H and glottal stop are allophones of different phonemes. They are in contrastive distribution, and we'll point to examples. And so, as seen by the examples, minimal pairs of cajon and caon, and hari and ari. And so that would be good enough to solve that problem. That problem is not quite a problem set, it's just data set with a question. And we answered that question clear enough. However, if we were to ask this question, so now consider the following Tagalog data and determine whether the two sounds d and r are in contrast or are allophones of a single phoneme. So I'll just pronounce these for you as well. So we have dating, dami, dumi, darating, mandurukot, daraing, marumi, marami, daing, mandukot. And the meanings in English are there if you want them. However, we're talking about phonology here, so we're mainly just focusing on the distributions and whether they change the meaning when we do get those distributions. But none of these words have the same meaning, so that goes kind of out the window. They have similar meanings, but that's because they're using different word pieces, which we'll talk about in morphology. But for now, we're talking about phonology. So determine whether the two sounds d and r contrast or are allophones of a single phoneme. So first we have to find the minimal pairs, use them to show the contrastive distribution, and then we can look for complementary distribution if that doesn't pan out. Okay, so now we can look at the distribution of the. So here I'll just highlight all the does that could help us. And then the distribution of ra, the r's. Okay. So what do we see? Well, are there any minimal pairs? There is between T and glottal stop. That's not helping us. There's a minimal pair between a and u, dami and dumi, but that's not helping us for solving this. Where are the minimal pairs for? There are none. So what we would say is that in Tagalog, D and R are allophones of the same phoneme. There are no minimal pairs. They're in complementary distribution. We see that D appears at the beginnings of words and after N, whereas R appears between vowels. So to say that kind of simply, R appears between vowels and R. So R appears between vowels while D appears everywhere else. And so that would be good enough to solve that problem. And so that will do it for this week. There's nothing else happening this week, so just become familiar with that kind of order of operations basically for solving basic phonology problems, and then you'll be ready for next week. So there's no discussion meeting on Thursday in recognition of National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And the readings for next week are the next two sections in Chapter 3, which are sections 2 and 3. Thank you. Don't forget to like comment, subscribe, and do your homework. Bye.